I want to start this episode with a quote, but I feel like I have to give a disclaimer for this one. So attention, some racist and sexist stuff coming up, and I distance myself from the content of this quote, as will be obvious. Quote, "The Oriental woman is a machine and nothing more. She doesn't differentiate between one man and another, smoking, going to the baths, painting her eyelids and drinking coffee. Such is the circle of occupations which make up her existence. We are thinking of her, but she is hardly thinking of us. We are waving an aesthetic on her account." Unquote. Gustave Flaubert, 1853. After letting that sink in, you might have some questions. What does he mean? Why does he generalize so much and make these assumptions? But also, what is an Oriental woman? What even is the Orient that Flaubert felt he was traveling through at the time of writing this letter? And how come this description of it is not a singular thing that we find in his work and then frown upon, but a really common way of talking about certain cultures? Also, why is it specifically Arab and Asian cultures that this refers to? Let's talk about Orientalism. I'm using this music with sarcasm, by the way. Orientalism is the name of a book by Edward Said. He was a Palestine-American scholar born in Jerusalem in 1935. After studying English literature in the US, he focused his research on political conflicts in the Middle East and was also a political activist in that field. He's most known for his work, Orientalism. This book is regarded one of the most influential works in social science and the humanities in the last decades. If you're familiar with Edmund Gettier, Said is the Gettier of colonial studies and culture studies. He single-handedly shattered a whole scientific discipline, namely Orientalism. He critiqued the whole basis of this science, and it was never the same after, which is for the best, by the way. Also, he kind of founded a new discipline, post-colonial studies. So yeah, Said was cool. Before looking at how exactly he destroyed Oriental studies, let's get familiar with the philosophical background and methods his argument is based on. The main approaches he conducts his argument in are discourse analysis and post-structuralism. Broadly speaking, both of these schools of thought emerged in the 70s and originally stem from linguistics and literary science. So for there to be post-structuralism, there must of course first be structuralism. So let's look at that. In structuralism, the world of language and thought, or the world itself, is an ordered, logical system which we can access through language. There are concepts like universal truth, because there is some kind of staticism to these systems, so truth can be accessed if looked for closely enough. Post-structuralism is way more relative. There is no universal truth or logical system, but many different ones that relate to the power dynamics in a society. There is no higher meaning to the structure, but it just reflects the individual culture and power relations of a group. Therefore, there are different discourses which can be analyzed in order to understand how a certain society works and who holds the power in it. As Michel Foucault puts it, quote, "Power not only creates true discourses, but what is much more important, it creates the constraints that allow us to separate true discourses from false discourses," unquote. What he means by creating true discourses is not true in the sense of metaphysical truth, but rather something accepted as and seemingly true. As he continues, this discourse then not only shapes what we see as true, but also how we judge true from wrong. Therefore, he says, quote, "We should try to reconstitute and study the ties that might exist among strategies of power, discursive practices, and the production of knowledge." Unquote. This is discourse analysis, looking at the language people use to see what they perceive as normal, true, and good. One example would be the generic masculine in languages like German, Spanish, and French, and many others, or calling certain pencils skin tone. It creates the impression of the default from which the other deviates. Discourses reflect and uphold power. Edward Said uses this way of analyzing language and literary works to look at Orientalism, as we will see in a bit. Before that, let's quickly talk about the other two concepts his work is based on. Base and superstructure are terms in Marxist theory. As with post-structuralism before, I will also only get into the most important part to understand Said here, but this is not a really good holistic view of these topics, of course. In short, base and superstructure describe the interplay between the material economic conditions in a society and its ideological layer. Part of the superstructure are also political and philosophical institutions. Basically, the superstructure of a society and of a base helps to sustain the existing economic order by justifying and normalizing it with words, values, and institutions. With Said, we will see what the underlying intention of Orientalism is by looking at it through the lens of base and superstructure. Lastly, I will just briefly mention that Said was not the first or only person to have raised claims in this direction. In the 70s, Indian scholars brought up the field of subaltern history, which describes the idea that even though colonialism might be officially over, history is still regarded from a colonizing point of view, and the effects of colonialism are not over at all. I love looking at things that seem obvious now and how they first emerged, and fought against the resistance of others for them now to be super accepted. So yeah, that was the background we need to understand Said's work, Orientalism. First, let's take a look at who Edward Said is even criticizing in his work Orientalism. He's criticizing the whole discourse over the so-called Orient, carried out by different groups. Specifically, he looks at the scientific discipline of Orientalism or Orientalist studies, which originally emerged in Vienna in the 14th century, but became more important during the 19th century and onwards. European and US American scholars conduct what they see as cultural analysis of the Orient in this discipline. The Orient, however, is not a fixed geographical place, but depends on the definition of each country. The countries considered part of the Orient are mostly North African Muslim countries, the Middle East, China, Japan, and India. So Said criticizes how these Orientalist scholars talk about the Orient, but also how politicians, authors, and citizens of France, the US, and England do. Edward Said's critique consists of 3 argumentative steps. First, the generalization and creation of a homogeneous so-called Orient. Next, the construction of difference and otherness of said Orient. And last, the justification of colonialism through this differentiation. Let's look at these steps in detail. Said takes a look at descriptions of the Orient both from before and during colonization. He gives examples of classical literature describing Arabs and other cultures as inferior that date back to Homer's Iliad. They continue through Dante's Inferno and, of course, the quote from the beginning. During English Romanticism, it was also a common motive to talk about a mystical but strange and incomprehensible East, including China and India. All of these descriptions share the trait of generalizing a huge area of land and cultural diversity into very specific and similar characteristics. There is little to no difference within the described people. They are depicted as one specific type of being, and these descriptions are similar in all of the literary works. They describe Chinese, Indian, or Muslim people as traditional, connected to nature, spiritual, and mystical, but ultimately strange and non-intellectual. Of course, generalizing other countries to some degree is normal if it is done due to no better knowledge of the topic and in an innocent way. At the time before Miles and More, it is normal for a middle-class poet in England not to know about the complexity of Indian customs or Chinese medicine. However, Said sees a structure in these types of generalizations, and this is no coincidence to him. It is also no coincidence that the use of the term Orient and its spread increased during the 8th century Middle Ages in Europe, when Islam was spreading and perceived as a threat to Christianity. Also, he renders it highly problematic that this way of describing the Orient now became a field of science at university. This way of putting a legitimization to these descriptions make them unaccessible and strengthen the notion of the existence of the Orient as is described by them. Countries that do not really share common traits from their point of view are forced into a group that is then generalized. So this is where his discourse analysis shows. He looks at what is perceived as normal in Northwest Europe and the US, the language, the use of the term Oriental and its associations, the normalization of this one-sided view are the discourses in these societies. There is no inherent truth to them, but they are seen as true and normalized by reoccurring in literature, etc. That's why he uses a lot of literary examples. Said criticizes not specifically the existence of science that investigates other cultures. Instead, he shows through examples that these scientists could not free themselves from the indoctrination of Orientalist views and then reproduce these biased views in a seemingly scientific way. An American journal of psychology, for instance, published a 4-page essay in 1972, which describes the essence of all Muslim and Arab people over the course of 1,300 years. So yeah. Science. By the way, I'm starting to think that these early Orientalist scholars were some very special people, because there's a quote in Thomas de Quincey's Confession of an English Opium Eater that says, quote, "On his departure, I presented him with a piece of opium. To him, as an Orientalist, I concluded that opium must be familiar." The next step of Said's argument is showing how Orientalists use the concept of otherness. Remember the spread of Islam in Europe in the early Middle Ages? This is where it mostly started, according to Said. Islam was spreading fast and reaching Europe, Indonesia, India, and northern Africa. This was perceived as a threat by Christians. Islam and Christianity share common roots, but despite that, or maybe because of it, the construction of essential differences rose. Demarcation of the Christian to the foreign, different and strained Muslim became part of Christian European identity. The Orient always exists in a weird balance of admiration and degradation. It is admired by poets and historians for its flourishing past, but then always degraded as inferior to the northern and central European countries. The West is associated with reason, science, progress, individualism, adulthood, and technology. The East, or Orient, is associated with emotionality, nature, collectivism, stasis, and infancy. Said or other post-colonial scholars say that these descriptions create otherness by only focusing on differences and simultaneously always positioning the West as superior. But this takes place within a more complex field of still recognizing the advanced civilizations in the past. There is, however, no attempt to overcome this difference. It is rather fostered and enjoyed, as the male fantasy of the exotic Oriental woman or the poetic longing for a place of connection to nature. This whole superiority complex goes so far as to thinking that they, the Orientalist scholars, can understand the Orient better than its inhabitants. Stuart Hall describes how this weird mix of depictions stem from the longing of English and French writers for a traditional base of their own culture, which they feel threatened by in the Orient. The Orient becomes the subject of fantasy, longing for traditionality and connection to nature in an industrialized world, while assuming superiority for this constructed reality. I would actually love to do a Lacanian or Zizek'ian analysis of this. Gender is also an important aspect in this differentiation of West and East. Maybe you realize that the terms reason, science, and progress versus emotionality, collectivism, etc. are also associated with masculinity and femininity in patriarchy. Edward Said also notices this and describes a parallel form of otherness used in patriarchy, again to establish dominance, just like in Orientalism. The East is seen as the emotional and inferior sphere of femininity, which has to be conquered by the Western reasonable man. This is a very common trope in literature and film. Wes Anderson's Darjeeling Unlimited shows India as a space of spiritual awakening for the white male traveler, while also sleeping with a random Indian woman, which is at full availability, of course. The movie has more facets, of course, and does not have to be interpreted this way, but it's still interesting how normalized this story arc has become. By putting the idea of exoticism over the culture observed, it has to be kept at a distance and estranged from us. It's exactly like the quote from the beginning, when Flaubert was using Gen Z slang and talking about the aesthetic of the Oriental woman. If you were to get to know the people better, find similarities, and engage in a dialogue, you would lose the fascination you feel and the exotic fantasy for them. That's why it is so hard to change. Still, why do these countries go through all of the constructing and discoursing and othering? Let's look at step 3. So far, we have seen how Said describes a generalized, estranged Orient constructed by the scholars and authors he cites. This alone would be reason enough to criticize. It's a view that is founded on white supremacy and cultural hegemony, now put in a scientific framework for it to seem legit. But Said goes even further. He describes how Orientalism is the ideological superstructure to the base of colonialism. If you remember, the superstructure can serve to legitimize and sustain the base through ideological institutions, philosophy, and values. Said goes all the way back to pre-colonial Europe to show how the way for colonialism was paved through othering of the non-European cultures. Then, during colonialism, Orientalism served as a way to justify imperialist politics. Therefore, it is no coincidence to Said that after Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, Orientalist texts and so-called research rose. I really think nothing is a coincidence to Said. He doesn't believe in coincidences. For him, it shows how people were trying to legitimize the degrading of other cultures by presenting them as culture-bound and inferior. It's kind of even a way to keep up the sentiment of being a morally good person, like trying to still feel like you're doing something good, helping in a way. That seems to be the underlying mechanism for this desire for justification, in my opinion. Some people might think that after many centuries of colonialism, people did realize that it was morally wrong, but upheld it for economic reasons. The examples Said cites show that this is not the case. The whole Orientalist way of thinking was and is internalized so deeply that it really continued to serve as an explanation for colonial actions. Said cites the speech of former Prime Minister Arthur James Balfour in 1910, talking about colonialism in the House of Commons. Great Britain was occupying Egypt for almost 30 years at that time, and some concern had been raised about this. I don't know why. So Balfour gave a speech which literally contains all of Said's points of criticism. He generalizes the Egyptians as incapable of self-reflection and understanding. He states that none of, quote-unquote, those nations are capable of self-government and how the British understand Egypt better than Egypt itself. That's how he justifies continued occupation of Egypt. And this is no singular case. I don't think it is necessary to give more examples of how these politicians talked and sometimes still talk about those nations because it's very depressing. This is how the superstructure of Orientalism helped to sustain the colonial system. It makes the idea of colonialism so resistant to change and so hard to affront because this view was so normal. But at the same time, there is always the idea of threat woven into this. It's really the Zizekian kind of racist fantasy between inferiority and threat. The paradox of this is how the colonial nations were so insistent on their supposed superiority, but then so eager to degrade Islam, for instance. Because if Islam was so inferior, they wouldn't have to worry and care so much about it, is what I mean. But of course, they paradoxically also felt threatened by it. We will see later how this still shows today. For now, let's look at some receptions of Said's work, Orientalism. In general, most of the criticism towards Said's Orientalism is not really attacking his general claim. This is really interesting and uncommon because his argument is so vast in its effects. But the basic idea of how othering of the so-called Orient nations shapes foreign politics was and is really hard to dispute. Still, there is a lot of criticism towards Said's methods. He basically founds his argument on various examples and creates a continuity and correlation from these to colonialism. The examples he uses directly correlated to colonial politics are actually very few. This is probably the biggest and most valid critique, and Said sadly never really reacted to it in an open way. I think it's because he's like that smart kid in math class who used a different approach to calculate the correct answer, and then the teacher's like, no, you should have done it the regular way, but the kid doesn't really care because they're still right. Another point of criticism is a funny paradox that I also struggled with in this episode, as you might have noticed. Said is criticizing a generalized view of the East, but then himself kind of generalizes the West. He tries to avoid this by actually specifying that he's mainly talking about France, Great Britain, and the US, but he still falls into this trap. Actually, the focus he put on these three nations is also disputable. As a German, I always wonder why he left out Germany. Shockingly, I read a source by a German scholar justifying this by saying that Germany had no substantial colonial past, and I was again shocked by how little Germany engages with this part of its history. Lastly, there is another point of criticism which reminds me of today's talk about identity politics. I'm thinking about doing an episode on identity politics, by the way, if I find a good approach. So basically, these critics say that following Said's argumentation, we can never understand a foreign culture and should not even try to do so. With this notion, we could only ever write and discuss about our own nation. If this came across in Said's work, I would definitely also criticize it. However, I personally don't think that's even remotely what he's saying. After all, he himself lived between two nations, so I think that wouldn't make sense. By the way, he also wrote a really interesting autobiography called Out of Place. There are even videos on YouTube and interviews with him you can watch, and one video of his daughter talking about the current situation in Gaza. Now, after having talked about Said's original work, let's look at how Orientalism shows today. In this section, I will basically make the claim that Orientalism still exists today. First, let's look at generalization and othering. I know this is a lot when watching the news in Germany. When talking about China or Japan or Korea, the stories presented are so often those that make you feel distant and estranged from these countries. They talk about people dating AI characters and going out with booked boyfriends cosplaying anime. I'm neither saying that this is never okay to cover such news, nor that this does not exist in Asia, but on the other hand, it should be clear that this is not the norm. And in the same sense, if news presented about Germany only covered a small subgroup of goth kids, that would make people from other countries feel like Germany is very different to them. Difference is not always bad, but the problem lies in lacking identification. If something is so different to what you know, you become inclined to identify more with distancing yourself from it than with trying to understand it. I don't think there is a manipulative bad intention behind it, but I do think it is problematic at a large scale. Then there is spiritual tourism as another problem connected to Orientalism. Due to exoticization, if this word exists, of India, China, Korea, and Japan, among others, there are more and more people traveling to temples, which should be a place for spirituality. If you look up certain famous temples in China, for instance, it looks like a musical festival, for real. Many Europeans or American people still have the idea that they can go to Asia and find their spiritual self, making Asia the background and instrument of their journey, instead of trying to really understand it. And I think everybody knows about Korea booze and Ollie London. However, there is one country that has a very ambivalent and special place in this: Japan. Japan has been, over time, perceived as the East by the West, and as the West by the East, the latter of which has for a long time been itself understanding. Japan was the first nation to not only reach equal, but higher level of industrialization, living standard, and economic prosperity as Western industrialized nations. Japanese politics therefore often position Japan distinguished from other Asian countries. Oh, and they also have another cool thing in common with Europe, being a colonizer. Nowadays, this idea of Japan has shifted, and Japan has branded itself as more Asian with the Cool Japan policy. This episode cannot cover this whole topic at all, but just briefly, Japan has invested in its soft power by exporting cultural goods like anime, manga, fashion, and cuisine into the world very successfully. In this context, a new term was coined: techno-Orientalism. The idea behind it is how, again, the West feels threatened by Japan as a powerful nation with advanced technology and a rich culture. So in describing Japan, they cannot pretend it's behind the West in any way. That would just be ridiculous at this point. Therefore, they do something else. They praise Japan's development and its traditional past, but then dehumanize its population. Japan is developed, yes, but it's too technological. People are not even real anymore. Japanese, or Asians in general, are described as cold and emotionless and remain fundamentally different from the West. Just like the quote at the beginning, when the Oriental woman was described as indifferent, remember? Japan is developed, yes, but it's just an imitation of our development. It lacks essence. Japan is more innovative in AI and futuristic technology, yes, but they are superficial and weird. Does this sound familiar? I think it is no coincidence that when Islam was perceived as the biggest cultural and developmental threat to Christianity, Arab Orientalism rose. Now that Japan, China, and Korea are threatening the West's hegemony in every way, Orientalism is more focused on these nations. I hope this was thought-provoking and interesting. Personally, I really noticed a change after engaging in this topic. I noticed how often people said things like, the East is spiritual and collectivist, or the West is so individualist, and stuff like that. And it just makes me think what the effect of this definite huge generalization is. I'm still learning too. Thank you for listening.